All right, chapter 2. Verse 3. As an apple tree among the trees of the wood, so is my beloved among young men. With great delight I sat in his shadow, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. Look out! It's a woman eating an apple from a tree in a garden.
We've seen this movie.
We've seen this before. Only this time the apple tree, it's the tree of life. And then suddenly another abrupt transition. Suddenly she's not sitting under the tree. Suddenly he brings her to a banqueting house, literally a feast of wine. This is the banquet where we eat and drink of Jesus, where he nourishes us, where we share in his fruitfulness. This is the Eucharist. This is going to come up many times. The bride here is not only fed, she's protected. She sits in his shadow with delight and lets him raise a banner over her. That's a sign that his armies stand ready to protect her. If God is for us, who can be against us? We can trust him. We can rest in him. Chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. This is read in the liturgy the week before Christmas. The voice of my beloved. Behold, he comes, leaping upon the mountains, bounding over the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag. Behold, there he stands behind our wall, gazing in at the windows, looking through the lattice. Behold, Jesus comes to earth, bounding with enthusiasm, and he says, verse 10, arise, my love, my dove, my fair one, and come away. He goes on to say, it's springtime, the garden is in bloom, it's time for love, it's time to come away with him. God still calls us to come away with him. I remember particularly a retreat from 3 years ago. It was at the Redemptorist Renewal Center. It was springtime. The desert was in bloom. I walked out into the desert very early the first morning while it was still cool and talked out all the issues I needed to discuss with God. I had some things on my plate with him. But I think I did that the first evening, actually. That took a few hours. And then after I talked out all the issues I needed to with God, I really did feel like, okay, we've got peace now. So I sat down under a cliff that was covered with petroglyphs, opened up my Bible, and this verse jumped right out at me, verse 14. O my dove, in the clefts of the rock, in the covert of the cliff, let me see your face, let me hear your voice, for your voice is sweet and your face is comely. And went, wow, all right, all the issues are off the plate. God just wants to spend time loving me. For the next better part of an hour, I had an intense experience of his presence. When I went back to my room, the first thing I saw, and I opened the door, and he just, again, jumped out at me, was my little icon of Solomon smiling at me. I pointed at it, and I said, you put me up to this. For the rest of the weekend, Solomon kept showing up, inviting me to come away with God. It was a crazy weekend and the best retreat ever. At the very end, there were lots of fun moments about that weekend, but this was great. At the very end, the retreat master announced that she had a souvenir to remind us of this weekend, and it came all the way from Jerusalem. At that point, I went, she's got to be kidding, right? Then she pulled this out and said, this is a piece of marble from Jerusalem, from the quarries that used to build Solomon's temple. And it's inscribed with the words, the desert will lead you to your heart where I will speak. At that point, I'm pretty sure I erupted in laughter. But when we take time to come away with God, we find peace. We find joy. We find his presence. Our souls will flourish like a garden in bloom. We walk with God in the garden in the cool of the day. We enjoy his presence. We till and keep the garden. When the flowers appear on earth, when we're fruitful for God, then it says the time of pruning has come. When we become fruitful for God, God prunes us to make us more fruitful. And the line, catch us the foxes, the little foxes that spoil the vineyards, for our vineyards are in blossom. God's saying your natural state is to be in blossom. Let's get rid of those little foxes that spoil the vineyards. What are those? Pride, envy, distraction. God helps us chase them away. when we seek rest with God and make time for contemplative prayer. Oh yeah, there's ups, there's downs, there's dryness. But we can begin to say with the bride, my beloved is mine and I am his. Any thoughts?
Did they not have that kind of experience that we have with God?
Now I got a couple of ways to go with this. Oh, wow. Short answer. As a general rule, people in Old Testament times did not have the Holy Spirit the way we do. There were people in Old Testament times filled with the Holy Spirit. We'll see there's a point later on where the bride talks about invoking the Holy Spirit, being filled with the Holy Spirit. And yet, that's something that's more characteristic of us, where God has poured out his Spirit upon all flesh, than it was back in the Old Testament. But then, I'm really curious when you say that, well, I mean, I've got my marriage on one hand and my relationship with God on the other, and you don't think it's a good metaphor. Explain why not.
I love my children different than the way I love Eva, different than the experience I have when I'm with God. And I would never equate it with another person, a physical relationship in any way.
And you know, that's a good point. I mean, it's funny because there's, on the one hand, this poem talks so much about the physical attributes of the bride and the bridegroom. But let's face it, it's really ambiguous as to whether or not there's any point in this poem where they actually make love. The point isn't the physical coming together, it's the desire, it's the longing, it's the beauty, it's the attractiveness. I'm totally stealing this from C.S. Lewis, by the way. You read this book, The Four Loves? I figured. The Four Loves. In Greek, eros, agape, philios, storge. Eros, erotic love. Agape, unconditional love. Love of God for his creatures. Philios, brotherly love, love of friends. Storge, natural affection, love of family. So, and also just the generic word for love, you know, love
four distinct groups of love.
Four distinct groups of love.
You
can have all at the same time.
And yet, thank you, that's the point I'm going towards. You can have a lot at the same time. If your love for your spouse is purely this, oh my goodness, you're in trouble.
Right.
You better have a hefty dose of agape in there. Sure would help to have a lot of philios and storge too. It's a mix. Some are purer than others. I mean, friendship love is philios. That is defined as friendship. You know, hopefully there's some agape in there as well, but really, friendship love is philios. But when it gets to the marriage relationship and our relationship with God, we start getting the whole spectrum. We really do. And Song of Solomon brings out that a real part of the spectrum in our relationship with God is eros, the longing for God, the falling in love with God, the experience of ecstasy, that really does happen and it's really a part of the relationship.
The joy of being.
The joy of being. Nope, I'm sticking with my guns. All right, where are we? Chapter 3. Upon my bed by night, I sought him whom my soul loves. It's pretty hard to look for someone when you're in bed and nobody else is there with you. This sounds like a nighttime prayer session more than anything else. She seeks him. She doesn't find him. Then she figuratively goes outside to look for him, which no proper Israelite maiden is going to do in a city at night. She seeks him. She doesn't find him. So she figuratively roams the city at night, calls out to the watchman, "Have you seen him whom my soul loves?" Then she finds him. She clings to him and won't let him go until she brings him into the private chamber of her mother's house. The message is simple. Seek to bring God into your chambers. Don't give up. Shout for him. Make a fuss. And when you find him, cling to him. Then suddenly a new scene. Chapter 3, verse 6. What is that coming up from the wilderness like a cloud of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all the fragrant powders of the merchant? Behold, it is the litter of Solomon. King Solomon makes his grand entrance. He's being carried on a palanquin, a litter of gold and silver and purple, surrounded by 60 armed men. He is dressed in his wedding attire, and he has come to meet the bride. Solomon in all his glory is an earthly picture of God in all his greater glory. Power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and blessing and glory are his. We revere God in his glory. We, like the daughters of Zion in this poem, are invited to come and gaze upon our one true King. We have been summoned by the King of love, and when we look at him, our hearts find peace. But God does not want us to keep a reverent distance from him, any more than King Solomon wants his new bride to keep a reverent distance from him. What God really wants us to do is jump into the royal box and start whispering sweet nothings in his ear, which we find in chapter 4. But first, I've got a quote here from Basil Pennington. "Blissful indeed for us is the day when the King of Peace, the blessed Solomon, the eternal King, the true lover, becomes the bridegroom of his people, inviting them into an intimacy that ever remains beyond anything they can conceive. Eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor has it entered into the human mind what God has prepared for those who love him." One final note on this scene. Solomon is wearing the crown with which his mother crowned him on the day of his wedding, on the day of the gladness of his heart. What is this crown? Christian interpretation has it that it's the humanity of Jesus, the gift of his mother on his wedding day, the day he came down from heaven and wedded himself to all humanity, his incarnation.